You're listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff, how are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
I'm doing great, and been giving a lot of thought to a specific topic today, which is kind of around what we do, right? We are the IAM strategists that companies bring in to help them develop their IAM strategy. So we're supposed to be the experts, right? And the idea would be that you could take some very specific area of IAM, like privileged access management or identity governance and or role management, and be able to dive into any specific area. But what I find we always have to do is make sure that we still have a very sharp answer on the basics. What is governance? What is an IAM program? So, Jeff, I've got a question for you. What is IAM?
Okay. It's an existential question. Who am I? What are you? All kinds of different things. Here's my short version of what is IAM. It's who has access to what. That's it.
That's it.
That's the distillation of it. More complex, yes. There are more things that come into it, but that's it.
Right. And I think that you have to be able to go down the side paths of there's more things to it. Because so think about governance, and I remember somebody boiling down to me in these terms. It's who gets to make what decisions. And I'm like, yeah, that's pretty much what governance is at the core, but there's so much more to it, right? There's, kind of a framework for formally how you run your program, how you keep involvement of your stakeholders, things like that. But, starting from a base explanation, like who gets to make what decisions is really a good starting point. Just like I am saying who has access to what. That's great. There's more to it, though.
Well, it's kind of like, it's a racy for real life. Who's accountable? It's funny, my wife and I were actually having a conversation about this last night because we have really great dinner conversations when we're talking about races at dinner. But it's the same thing. It's who can make what decision? Ultimately, it's like Highlander. There can only be one. Who is the A that the decision, rests on, and they're accountable for? They may not make the decision, but they're accountable for whatever that decision is, which can be good.
That's true. In an important area of IAM, I think we always focus on who has access to what. But what about when that who is not a who, or it's a non-carbon based life form, as we nerds like to say, or a silicon based life form? In other words, it's that machine identity. And I think that's one of the topics we're going to dig into today.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting where we're getting right here. There was a news article this week that the U.S. Patent Office has basically said AI is not allowed to patent things. So it has to be a human. So I guess that's good news, is we've staved off the robot overlord invasion for at least a little bit of time before they take over. But machine identity, for example, is very difficult. Now we're talking about bots. Now we start to get into, okay, how do we kind of weave these things together between humans, non-humans, and at some point there's probably a whole bunch of in-betweens in that. And there's this concept of an identity fabric that kind of is the pattern or quilt or whatever sewing analogy we want to use that is intended to kind of pull all this together in a way that makes sense. And why don't we bring in our guest for this week to help us with that conversation? His name is Paul Fisher. He's the lead analyst at KuppingerCole. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. And I believe you're coming from the UK and having this conversation with us. Is that right?
I am. I'm in an area called Twickenham in London, Greater London. Twickenham, if you don't know it, is famous for its rugby ground, or rugby stadium, I should say. It's known as the home of English rugby, which is great, except I'm not interested in rugby at all. But that's the only claim to fame that we have here. So we have some big rugby matches, internationals and things. But yeah, great to be here, joining you from London.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. And one of the things that we like to get into here is kind of the background of the folks that we have on the show to really kind of understand the viewpoint that they're coming at this conversation from. So I know we're going to talk about machine identities, identity fabrics, and all the stuff in between. But before we get into that, how did you get into identity and access management? Is it something that you chose, or did it choose you?
Yeah, well, I think it kind of chose me, really. I mean, if we go back, I'm not going to go back the entire of my life, but probably I used to be an IT journalist for many years, up until about the early 2000s. And as you probably know, IT journalism was a fairly insecure occupation then, and it's now almost doesn't exist. So after a few, went to some places like AOL, which also proved to be less than fruitful. And then a few years ago, I became the editor of a magazine called SC, or Secure Computing. So that was my real introduction to, I guess, the world of cybersecurity. And from then on into, sub areas like identity and access management. And then I got into becoming an analyst, and it was not at KuppingerCole, where I am now, but a previous analyst firm was where I first started to really start looking at identity and privilege access management and related areas in more detail, and started sort of taking it seriously, I suppose. So, yeah, it's probably not something that I would have chosen if I was given a list of things to specialize in. I don't know if identity and access management would have been right up there, but it has actually turned out to be. It sounds like a damning it with faint praise, but it's a lot more interesting than you might think. So, so yeah, I'm a lead, but I should say I'm a lead analyst. I don't want my colleagues at Kupping to get upset when you sound like I'm the lead analyst. I'm only one of a few lead analysts. That's our hierarchy, and of course we have Martin, who is our overlord, as it were.
He's the lead analyst.
Yeah,
right?
he's the Uber analyst, I guess, is one way of saying it. So yeah, and that's where I am now, and I've been at Kuppinger for nearly 3 years.
Paul, what are the areas of IAM that you focus on?
Yeah, so I was given privilege access management as one of my sort of key topics at Kuppinger. And so I've really focused on that quite a lot in the last 2 years. But it's recently I've been branching out a lot more into identity and access management in more general, and then looking at things that you mentioned earlier at the top there, things like our identity fabric and Dream, which is our latest sort of paradigm for managing identities within multi-cloud infrastructures, etc. So I also do some related stuff, so a bit of data governance and things like that. But I think that really everything. One thing I know about IT now, or identity, is the more you know, the less you know. It just gets more complicated. Just when you think you've kind of cracked it, or you don't, that'll solve everything. It gets worse.
You start to realize how much you don't know.
Yeah, and I don't know a lot. I would.
Well, you do know you do know enough to have a good conversation about. I think we're going to get into the privilege access management side of things, but this identity fabric, and it's kind of a new term, right? And it's something that you guys have spun up at KC, I believe. But let's start with that kind of the basic question, like Jeff and I were yammering on about, where, let's not just assume we know what identity fabric is based on, what the name implies. Let's just ask the question, what is the identity fabric?
Yeah, I think people, the word identity fabric suggests a kind of a cloak almost, or something you wrap around an infrastructure, and almost as an extra layer of security. And I think that is probably misleading. The way I describe it is that it puts identity at the center of everything, not the infrastructure. So instead of making identity and access management have to meet the requirements of the infrastructure, you need to build the infrastructure around identity and access management, or more particularly around identity. But that's the kind of philosophical view. But more, what we're talking about is an adaptive set of capabilities. So your identity and access management platform or your solutions are adaptive and can be changed and change as your demands change. So I think it's really about modernization of identity and access management. It's about fluidity, agility, all those buzzwords. But probably sort of key to our discussion is that we're moving away from a world of just simply human identities or traditional privilege accounts into a world where we don't really know half of the identities that exist in and or the identities that may be having some access to the infrastructures that we have. So we need, and that it obviously includes things like machine identities, applications, little bits of code, and all sorts of stuff that's now buzzing around infrastructure. And I'm sort of known at KuppingerCole for coming up with a universe of this and a universe of that. And I think that we often see IT infrastructures as kind of linear structures with things sticking off at right angles and this way, and then there's a server there and there's something else there. And I think it's becoming much more like the Amazon rainforest or a coral reef kind of ecosystem where there is just millions of life forms that all depend on each other and they all run around. And it's actually harder to visualize that or to make sense of it than it is to actually just think about the identities that are using it. And if you concentrate on the identity, what they need access to, what role they have, and how long they need access, it shouldn't matter so much what the infrastructure looks like. So we're kind of turning everything inside out, and that's I hope describes what we mean by an identity fabric.
That's pretty deep, actually. Yeah, that's even more philosophical than I even contemplated. Obviously, we named the podcast Identity at the Center, so we kind of have a similar viewpoint, right? Which is that you have, and we've seen this in our careers, major shifts in the technology landscape from, the on-prem data center environment to now very much a cloud-based environment. Who knows? Maybe it'll shift back the other way at some point. That's the way IT has seemed to go throughout our career, and kind of prior to our career was shifts back and forth. And I mean, if anybody thinks that things are going to stay static for the next 100 years, you're out of your mind, right? I mean, we know change is the one thing that we can be sure of. But what I think is important is that idea of, if you have good controls around the identity, they should be able to adapt to that infrastructure.
Yeah. I mean, IT is all about people doing stuff, right? In the end, and it's all about applications doing stuff. And increasingly, there are more and more applications, and people are now used to downloading an app and then immediately using it. So you're right about things do come round, though. I mean, I remember back in the 90s, everyone was talking about the network computer. And what a great idea that was, because you have a dumb terminal and you just fire up a virtual machine and you'd connect just for your work that you needed. You'd get the applications you needed, etc. And when you shut it off, it was gone forever. And I think we're sort of almost talking about that again now with web applications, except it's much more sophisticated. and you can do so much more. I mean, I think those dumb terminals had some kind of browser-based applications. I can't remember now because it actually, but they came and went. We talk about on-premises dying a little, but I agree with you. It's actually, if you talk to people in the real world, they still like to have stuff on premise. Even people are still using mainframes. I found out the other day. So, which was because even mainframes even predate me and you, I'm sure. So,
for sure. Jeff and I, we had a client that has over 100 mainframes without a strategy to get off the mainframe. So that means they're going to be around for quite a while.
Well, IBM,
happy to hear that.
Well, yeah, exactly. IBM they're still selling them and doing quite a good business, I think, out of mainframe stuff. And they say that they have people that actively ask for them. So yeah, but what is different though is, to get to the point of our discussion, is the number of identities, the number of access points, the number of privileged accounts. And then I was talking to a vendor the other day. They claimed that when their solution was installed by their customer, they found 10 million privileged accounts, to clarify, they found 10 million standing privileged accounts. So that was 10 million accounts that had been opened and never closed. And were basically an open surface. Exactly. But I was staggered at like 10 million accounts have been created over the years, I guess, and never been controlled. And that's where the philosophy comes up against the reality, I guess, of business computing. And that's the other thing that I try to bring into whatever I write, is that we are in the end talking about business solutions. And sometimes in our world, it's easy to get carried away with the technology and, like I say, talk about the coral reef or the Amazon rainforest and things like that. But the reason why this stuff exists is because businesses want to do stuff. And if we take, the car industry, automotive industry as a good example, they are an example of digital transformation in action. They're moving from an engineering-led industry into a software-led one. And they are the people that are actually the customers for all this stuff. They are the people that really are trying to manage all these identities in the real world. So, as I said, we can talk about philosophies, but the way that when we talk about the identity fabric, it's our way of kind of clarifying what people need to do to manage what's going on in their organizations.
Well, I think it's the evolution of the business process, like you just mentioned, right? These things didn't exist 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. So these business processes are now being replaced by software, right? Software is eating the world, is I think, one of the statements that's kind of been out there. And I guess from a management perspective, and when I think management, I'm thinking identity management. We have this kind of core concept of human versus non-human. And now I'm thinking of more like, does it matter so much? It's just an entity that needs access. Does it really matter if it's a human or not? Because at the end of the day, it's still who has access to what, and is it appropriate, right? And all those kind of key things that go along with it. And I guess I'm wondering, from your perspective, do you see it that way as well? But also, in addition to that, how do machine identities fit into this? What's so special about them? And I guess, are they special when it comes to identity fabric?
Yeah, well, I think you kind of said it there. In the end, does it actually matter what the identity is that is trying to access? Let's say an identity is trying to access a server. You have to just, does it matter whether that's human or non-human, or machine or non-machine? Which is now the cool way to say human and non-human. So machine and non-machine. to get ready for our overlords.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it seems to me like that's more machine positive language that we're using.
Yeah.
If we say, well, either a machine or you're not.
So let's assume that anyway, an identity wants to do something in a network. Really, if the identity and access management or the privilege access management is set up correctly, it should know not what that identity is, but what it's trying to do and what it's trying to access and whether that's okay, really. Because the network doesn't know. When things are being switched, they don't know whether it's a human or a non-human or an application that's looking for access. So why do we care so much? And I think the vendors are coming around to that quite a lot as well, particularly in privileged access management. They didn't used to talk about machines very much. Now they talk about them all the time. They spoke about admins, which is kind of seems now like a really kind of slightly prosaic thing. The admins that need access to an endpoint to squirt to do something. Who knows what admins are? Were admins? Why are they human? Probably not. Service accounts do stuff like that. So my view is that there is nothing special about machine identities, particularly any more than there's nothing special about human identities. I think they're just identities or entities, which I think you said as well, which is probably even better to talk about entities. And it's just the sheer pace of everything as well. It has, financial services is another example of digital transformation in action. It's gone from a very staid industry to one that's embraced software development, it's embraced agile and DevOps and everything because they need to create code all the time. So we can't get in the way of that, and we've established that now as a way of working, and the software companies themselves are doing the same thing. So which brings us on to things like software supply chain security, which is related to all this, but I just think that my view is what the identity is really doesn't matter.
I think there are implications for the IAM practitioner in the difference between human and non-human identities. And I come at it from this standpoint. I feel like I've gotten very good in terms of managing the human identities, especially in the enterprise context, especially with employees. You set up employees in the HR system. When they join the organization, leave the organization, change job roles, that's the quote unquote authoritative source. Ideally, you either have a parallel for non-employees or there may be even in your HR system. However, when it comes to non-human identities, it could be a number of stories. When you have that DevSecOps environment, you have developers who now need to create machine accounts. Do they go through some central process to make sure that it's going through proper channels for approval and being documented? Do you have a way to discover if you're creating those identities out of process? And then with service accounts, the ideal scenario is you do go through some kind of ticketing system. There's a paper trail for the request and approval of the creation of the service account. And then you're managing the service account life cycle, including, management of the credential. So, i.e. password, make sure you're rotating the password and no humans know the password because, we kind of joked earlier about the attack surface. Machine identities can multiply your attack surface, especially if you don't have good controls over those machine identities. So I don't think they're different in terms of, a lot of the aspects you just talked about. I guess the thing I wanted to bring to the table is we've gotten down to really best practices for management of the humans, and I think for the non-humans, it's where for the state of maturity of organizations as a whole is not nearly as good as it is with humans.
So you're saying that we've kind of got human identities pretty much under control, give or take, but the machine identities we're way off that. Is that?
I think the 80-20, that's what I see.
Yeah. You see, that's why I don't know whether that's true. I think that, I mean, in privilege access management, there is now a kind of a divide opening up between newer vendors, smaller startup type of guys that have built cloud native applications from the ground up, versus the CyberArks, the Beyond Trust, the well, I was going to say Thytok and Centrify, but they're now called Delinea, and who come from the very regulated Vault password rotation setup, versus the newer guys, which have decided, yeah, you can have a Vault if you want, but we're just going to do just in time. For the reason being that we know that there's this whole new world of an influx of identities that want privilege access to stuff. And we don't think there's time to issue passwords or anything else, but just manage those identities equally and give them just-in-time access when they need it. So that the problem with that is that there is an argument that isn't secure enough. The older, more established players will say, yeah, but you don't have any analytics, you don't have any governance. You don't. What happens when it doesn't work? How are you going to find it? Like you mentioned, a paper trail. So it's probably easier to do that with humans. I don't know, but I think ultimately we'll see PAM become much more focused on just in time and ephemeral, but will become better. Those vendors that are emerging will become better at the stuff that they're missing at the moment. So I think my money would be, if I was betting on PAM itself, my money would be on some of those vendors for a long-term future bet. But I still think that in the end, we haven't got time to worry about whether humans or machines or aliens or whatever else wants access to our businesses. So
we had a guest on our last episode, Mike Fraser, VP of DevOps over at Sophos, and he quoted the Star Trek, "Resistance is futile."
Yeah.
Welcome to the Borg. But I did want to. This is exactly why having you on the show is so cool, because you've got a different perspective as an analyst. You're out there seeing what's coming. What are these new inventions in this space? The new players, and you're getting an earlier view of that. Whereas I think Jeff and I are going into organizations and we're trying to talk about best practices that are being used in the industry. So it's lagging a little bit behind kind of the cutting edge, what's new. But also from an analyst perspective, you're also working on new frameworks and new concepts, ways of thinking about things. You've got a concept called dream. And when I see that, I think of, I have a dream or living the dream. But give us an idea of what it is. So it's DREAM. Talk to us about what that is. What is dream?
Well, first of all, just your point, and you're right. You probably we don't live in a fantasy world, but we do live in a world where perhaps we're predicting what's going to happen. But then that's our business, I guess. So Dream, as you say, there used to be a pop group in England called DREAM, which was D/REAM for some reason. So I tend to, in my head, I always say DREAM, but to be serious, what it stands for is dynamic resource entitlement and access management. So we've seen that the market is changing to accommodate multi-cloud infrastructures, hybrid structures, etc. And Gartner came up with KIM, or their cloud infrastructure entitlement management grouping, and we've sort of taken that a bit further. So yeah, I think Gartner was right to identify KIM, and also cloud security posture management, which I think they've now merged into another acronym, which I forget right now. But they were right to see that cloud entitlement and access management was, well, that needed managing, and there was an emergence of vendors to do all that. But we noticed, as I kind of hinted just now, that within the PAM market itself, first of all, they had started to understand the unique needs of the DevOps or DevSecureOps and Agile groups in getting privileged access to stuff quickly. And so that invariably meant that DevOps tend to work almost 100% in the cloud and use cloud resources. So we thought, well, that's actually a cloud infrastructure entitlement management thing. But then there is also these vendors themselves, which are now doing KIM. So we thought, well, let's put those together. And we thought that the world is moving to dynamic infrastructures. Everything is in and out. Things are spun up and spun down. Quite often, privileges are opened and often left open and things like that, which is part of the downside of all this. That IT managers increasingly have not much control over lines of business that are downloading stuff, building machines, building virtual machines, building code in their departments. So if they can't direct, in the old days, in the old days of perimeters, etc., and firewalls, they could have just stopped people doing that. But that's no longer possible. Plus, they have the business side of the enterprise that actively encourages this stuff because, like I said, the car industry wants those guys to be building a new bit of software for their latest electric vehicle, and they want that to be updated over the air as often as possible. So we've brought together all of that, and we're doing a leadership compass, which I should explain. A leadership compass is a report that KuppingerCole does on a particular product sector. So we've kind of invented this dream sector, which is what Gartner does. So why can't we do it? And we've invited a number of PAM vendors that perhaps do some cloud management or do some PAM for DevOps, plus a number of the dedicated KIM vendors, all of which seem to have been, from my research so far, most of these KIM vendors didn't exist 5 years ago. So it's a really new part of the business. And they're all, small startup type of outfits, but they're all attracting a lot of money from the VC community. So that's what Dream is. It's our assessment of any platform that can discover and can manage access, or rather, sorry, can discover those identities that have access to cloud resources and can manage that access, usually from some kind of dashboard, and can switch that off or switch it on, can prevent access. But crucially, it can actually look at things which are happening on Amazon Web Services, so it gets quite granular, or it can, most of these KIM platforms, and not all of the PAM platforms actually, will cover the 4 main cloud providers. But they, as I said, they are mostly dashboard driven. They are mostly web based on a web application. And the KIM ones in particular are really quite exciting. I mean, they are, and this is where I probably get a bit overexcited, because I was about to say they're quite fun to use. But I think the fact that they work in a dashboard, and you can see the entitlements, you can see who has access, and you can see, getting back to whether they're humans or machines, you can see what kind of identity it is. So that's for us, is our way of making sense of this, trying to manage everything moving to the cloud and hybrid clouds. And that comes back to what I was saying earlier. Like the dashboard is a focus there. And the dashboard is the focus on identities and their activities and what they're accessing. What's around that dashboard is kind of the infrastructure, and that doesn't really matter to what you're seeing within it. So I hope that explains Dream. I think actually I explained it to myself quite well there, so I think I understand it better as well. So, and that report is, as I said, I'm working on right now, and we'll publish it in May sometime. So yeah, dream on. I have a dream, and there it is.
Well, it's a great acronym, and I guess I've got 2 follow-up questions for you. The first is stupid. And my stupid question is, what comes first? Is it the identification of a space like this, or do you come up with the acronym and say, how do we fit IAM
well,
into that?
That's a trade secret. Heaven
Sure
forbid that we would come up with something as nice as Dream and then fit everything around it. But in this case, yeah, I mean, we wanted the word dynamic in there. So because I think dynamic does describe what's happening quite well. One of my colleagues came up with this. I can't remember which one. But we went through. The process is that we realize that something is happening perhaps in the market. We realize that there are vendors doing some new things, and we notice that the way businesses are doing infrastructure is changing. So then we think, well, that seems to be a new category of platform or product, and then we think of the acronym afterwards. So I'm sure that's what.
I imagine there's like a whiteboard somewhere with just a whole bunch of like terms, and then it's a little bit like Mad Libs or some word game, right? Where you're trying to order them in a way that makes some sort of nifty sounding acronym.
Yeah, I think we might have had DRAM or something before someone said, "Hang on," or. But yeah, whiteboard is a very popular tool with my boss Martin. Actually, he loves the Microsoft whiteboard. I mean, the one that comes thrown in with Teams, etc. So that's the process. And as I said, I love talking to some of these new vendors as well, because they're kind of really enthusiastic about what they do, and most of them have some track record in identity business. I guess that's the way to say. They've done startups in the past, and now they're doing another one, and so on. So it's a great time to be covering identity, I think.
Well, speaking of kind of the space, the second part of my question or follow up is, I can't imagine that the established privileged access management players, right? And when we think of kind of like the big ones, CyberArk, Beyond Trust, Psychotic, all the ones that are out there, is that they're going to cede this ground willingly. And so when I see a bunch of these little startups kind of come up with new technology, it almost strikes me as like, okay, either CyberArk, let's just pick on CyberArk or Beyond Trust, right? They're either going to build it themselves, or they're going to go out and acquire one of these smaller startups and kind of augment their existing solution to become, that much more complete from a service offering. do you see a consolidation taking place in this space that would merge privilege access management with cloud infrastructure entitlement management, or dynamic? I'm not going to get it right, but the dynamic resource allocation, things like that.
Well, it is happening. I think. Let's take CyberArk again. They've actually not rebranded, but they've kind of repitched the entire business along identity now, rather than privilege access management, and they have now got a cloud entitlement tool within their portfolio. So that's their way of responding. And Beyond Trust, I'm sure, are looking at it the same way. I think we will see some acquisitions, maybe some of maybe one of the two of the KIM providers. The problem with that is that the KIM providers also offer some form of privilege access management within their own platform. And I wouldn't say that the big players are threatened, or there's still plenty of business out there for PAM, pure PAM. But I don't think it's as easy as them acquiring perhaps a KIM startup, because the technology is so different, and they built this stuff, like I said, cloud native. It's so up to date. It's built for cloud environments. So we are seeing I think that in the last few years there has been some consolidation in PAM. Psychotic and Centrify, as we mentioned, have merged into now called Delinea. So they're in the process of merging two sets of capabilities into one, which either suggests that they felt that scale will help them compete, or that was a way to compete with, say, Beyond Trust and CyberArk. CyberArk, as I said, their response has been to change the focus slightly, so that they are looking to reinvent themselves. I think CyberArk have the resources and expertise to do that. But we're also seeing some traditional identity players moving into this market as well. SailPoint and Okta are playing a little bit in privilege access management. And then, of course, the cloud providers themselves, they all have some level of privilege access management built in automatically, as does Microsoft. So far, none of those have really shown much interest in developing it beyond their own proprietary systems. So there's movement going on, but it doesn't. I mean, the number of PAM. If I talk about another report I do, PAM Leadership Compass, the number of vendors in that has actually stayed about the same. Even within consolidation, there are some newer within PAM itself. There are also some newer, more cloud native PAM providers coming up. So it's a market that is really in a great state of flux. The other thing that is affecting this is software supply chain. So not exactly an identity matter in a classical sense, but all these DevOps guys and all these people doing stuff with open source code, for example, create some kind of threat vector, but just by doing that, and that stuff is all mixed up in this, infrastructure that we're talking about. So it's a fascinating world, and I think, I look forward to seeing what it looks like maybe in 5 years' time. I predict that some of these KIM providers will get swallowed up, they'll merge, or they'll get bought out by perhaps a bigger player. Microsoft, in fact, did acquire I'm pretty sure they acquired a KIM vendor recently. Yeah. Is that right? I think I'm right on that. And so that could happen. Microsoft haven't done much with it so far, but it was only a few months ago. So we'll see.
Yeah, I wanted to throw a few thoughts out there myself, Paul, because I think, from a customer perspective, customers don't want to have to keep going and finding new vendors to solve these problems. I also think, though, one of the challenges is that, PAM was designed around the traditional on-prem. Now you've got infrastructure as a service, and there are companies whose strategy is to say, we're all in on a particular infrastructure, whether it's Amazon, Google, Microsoft, you name it. Then there are others that say, we're going to let our IT teams, our business teams choose the cloud that works best for them. In that latter scenario, to me, it seems like that's the messaging from the KIM providers is, to try to manage identity across these clouds, which all operate very differently in terms of how they manage identity, you need a tool, and your traditional PAM can't do that. I think from, customer perspective, still they want their PAM tool to be able to extend into the cloud. And if they choose one cloud provider, say Amazon, they don't want to have to buy a separate tool to manage that. So I feel like there's this kind of tug of war, and what's being lost is what the customer really wants, which is support for the quote unquote hybrid enterprise, which is almost everybody. There, other than small organizations, you have both. Some very small organization might be all cloud. I haven't run into a organization recently that has no cloud, right? Almost, I'd say basically every large organization has some cloud infrastructure now. So I think companies want, one tool. So either for a PAM to have the KEAM capabilities, or a KEAM player to stand up and say, oh, by the way, we can do your on-prem infrastructure as well. We can do password vaulting or privileged session management and that audit trail. We can do the whole 9 yards. So to me, that's the ground where we hit the most success. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And I think the organizations also use multiple clouds from different vendors, so they'll probably use Azure and Google, and they might not even know who's using what. Yeah, I get that. The if you went for a KIM vendor, say, right now they're not going to be able to do the traditional PAM stuff. On the other hand, the more traditional PAM providers are probably not as good or as fast at managing identity access to cloud resources. But I think this conundrum is long standing. The idea that a customer will get something and that's it. This will last for a decade, and the vendor will provide enough upgrades for us to keep in touch with our own changing circumstances, and I don't think that will ever happen. I just think it's a bit like, you buy an iPhone or a tablet. 2 years later, you realize that it's no longer fast enough, or it's no longer can do the things that you want to do right now, so you buy another one, and so on. So that is kind of multiplied 1 million times within an organization. I guess our job at Kuppinger is obviously to advise people as best we can on what they should invest in, what they should purchase, to get a ratio of fit for purpose versus obsolescence as best that we can advise. So, and that's where, if they said we have lots of privilege accounts, we still have stuff on premises, we work in a highly regulated industry, then a zippy but feature like Kim solution probably wouldn't be the right one. And we would probably say you need a good, solid privilege access management platform. And this is from analyzing your business. So we're never going to be able to say that a vendor or a solution is going to be good for everyone. The only thing I would say is that pace of development within the Kim sector, from what I've seen so far, is pretty rapid. And it's probably more rapid than what's happening in privilege access management. But to get back to the original, I think they are responding, like CyberArk, Beyond Trust. They are realizing that maybe they had overlooked this market, but they're making moves now to do something about it. So if the message to a customer that's already perhaps invested in a PAM platform of one of those types would be, don't panic. Probably they will come up with some part or a new set of capabilities that will deal with your multi-hybrid, your dream environment. So, yeah, I mean, it's not an easy thing. You'll never find anything that will probably be fit for purpose forever, but you might find something that will be fit for purpose. I don't think things are so dynamic at the moment that everything's out of date by next week. Although that might happen decades into the future. Who knows what hell we might be trying to advise on in then. But for now, I think that's the best answer, which is, get what works for your type of organization, your kind of people, etc.
I can see it in the future. We started by dumping on the mainframe. It's like, oh, there's still mainframes out there. At some point, it's like, I remember we had Active Directory servers on premise, right? It's like it's just the way that things work. Paul, you've been really great with your time. I know we've only got a few minutes left with you, so I want to start to kind of wrap things up. And one of the ways we do that is to have a little more fun conversation to kind of end this talk we've been having.
So that wasn't fun?
Oh, it was plenty of fun. For identity nerds like you and me and Jim and probably the people who are listening to this show, for sure. But a little bit of a lighter note, and we had a pretty good conversation on Monday as we were kind of prepping for this call around photography, and I forgot other things. And we actually went down a pretty good rabbit hole of kind of like some of our interests. So want to come up with something different for today, and that is, here's the question for you. If you could instantly become an expert in something not identity related, okay, I know that's probably going to be your number one choice. What would it be?
Yeah. Well, my first reaction to that would be some kind of diplomacy or diplomatic genius that could solve conflict in the world. But let's not dwell on that. Instead, I've always been fascinated by economics, and I find I would love to be expert in. I'd love to be an economist, but to the level of someone. I'm trying to think of a famous economist, but someone that is internationally renowned, but also. I just think the way economies work or don't work, the way that everything affects everything else, the profit and loss, market supply and demand, why things go up, why they go down, all that stuff is. I mean, I've read economic textbooks and come out more confused than before. So, and I once saw a documentary on TV about. And I think the message was that economists don't really understand it either. But they do the best they can. Yeah, they do the best they can. But sometimes they think the economy is a kind of a self-governing or self-perpetuating machine that we actually don't control. So how does inflation start and how does it get out of control? All that stuff is fascinating. So I'd love to be able to give answers on that. But Yeah, and also I'd probably be a lot richer, I think. So,
I like how you put that towards the end of the answer, because that's
yeah,
immediately what I was thinking. I was like, okay, yeah, like if I'm good at the
yeah,
economy, I'm probably, doing pretty well for myself. I think it's a fascinating subject for sure, because I think it's, there's obviously, the financial aspect of it, knowing how financial vehicles work, right? Whatever that looks like, but also psychology of humans.
mm,
And you're trying to predict human behavior. What's going to happen if, you know, well, if a boat in the Atlantic catches fire with a whole bunch of sports cars on it,
yeah.
not that didn't happen recently, right, in the world. Like, what does that mean, right, for the
Yeah,
economy of those companies or wherever they were intended and things like that?
yeah, for sure. And why does war cause stock markets to go down and pandemics? Well, I guess the obvious answer is because industry won't function, etc. But um, you know, it's just our whole world is governed by economics, and our system of way, or well, our whole way of living. And most of us don't really understand how it works. I don't even get, like, I remember at school the teacher was like, couldn't understand why I couldn't understand how money could be electronic. And if you don't have the cash in your hand, I thought, well, how can all these numbers get transferred from one account to another? Where's the actual money? You see, that's what.
It's like the old days, right? You'd show up and like, here's a pouch full of coins.
Yeah,
That should do it. And it wasn't even like you knew what the amount was. Like, yes, feels about right. Let's go and do our thing.
but but even now, I still think that, like, every month I get a statement with some numbers on, and that converts into pounds. But nothing ever changes hands, and that's the one thing that really bugs me. Is that's fundamentally the way the whole system works, is just stuff being transferred from one place to another, and it's all numbers.
Yeah, we
Who
just agree that works.
Yeah,
Okay,
and that,
accept
and that,
this.
and that's what wealth is, or lack of it. So um and now in Britain, we literally almost have a cashless society, thanks to the COVID thing. People didn't want to carry change anymore, so now we have the technology um, to bypass that, and so now virtually everything is paid for with card or phone. Um,
It's
it's quite
really
a
interesting you bring that up,
yeah,
because last year was the first time that I can confidently say the year 2021, I did not use cash or coins for anything.
yeah,
Every purchase that I made last year involved electronic transfer of funds.
yeah,
I still have the same currency in my wallet. Haven't been to the bank. I mean, it's a really interesting time, which I love, because I think it's great from an efficiency standpoint. But it certainly is an interesting time to be alive, if
yeah.
if that concerns people.
And isn't it also like this pandemic has happened at a time when we're advanced enough to carry on pretty well? We had, thanks to our IT, that we could work remotely. We could do stuff like this. We have payment systems that don't require physical activity and so on. So, yeah, I wonder what a pandemic would be. Well, we know, don't we? I mean, the Spanish flu, I guess, was a very different experience for people. So, yeah, that I've got a book that actually, I can't remember what it's called, but it's nice to dip into now and again, because it kind of provides an antidote to all the gloom. Uh, with global warming, war, everything else going on, crazy politicians. That actually a lot that's happening in the world is far better. We're in a better state than we think we are. We've got rid of a lot of illness. There's more democracy. There is actually less war and things like that. So I keep that by the bed.
I like the positive outlook on things. I think
Mm,
that we sometimes lose sight of all the
mm.
the bad news headlines, but there is plenty of good in the world. Jim, if you could become a instant expert in something, what would it be?
Yeah, I won't weigh in on the economics too much because I could turn this very gloomy very quickly. I do use cash still, by the way, and I don't think that saves me from any kind of potential economic collapse that could take place. But as things become more computerized, it's not just ransomware that is our issue. There are state-sponsored attacks that are possible. I mean, there are zero-day bugs that are found all the time that all the financial institutions, global financial institutions, count on commercial software, and it's very vulnerable. I think in the big picture, if we went to war with Russia or China. So that's my concern on that front. So there's your gloom. I said I wasn't going to do it, but I did
thanks,
it anyway.
Jim. Thanks for wading us into the geopolitical power struggles. How about something else?
Okay, so what I looked at this question from a couple angles, and one of the angles was, what do I do already? What do I find interesting? And I spend my time researching, because sure would be great to, I think if you're doing it for free, you'd love to do it as a career. And so, or even not as a career, but just to be an expert on. And the topic I came up with, what number one was longevity. And so from a longevity standpoint is, what are the things that you can do to get the most out of this human form that we have, to both make it live longer, but also have a higher quality of life, from a physical perspective, also from, your mind operating at a peak capacity and getting the most out of the time that you have here on Earth. And so, I think one of the challenges with longevity, though, is it's just like science. So I think that, that we've got this mantra in the world of, I follow the science. I follow the science. Well, science only knows what science knows. And usually what science knows is the result of studies. So if those studies were never done, and by the way, studies are usually done to generate a profit. Not always, right? There are some studies that are funded by institutions just to see how things work. But a lot of the studies that are done to test a pharmaceutical. Will this pharmaceutical result in, X, Y, and Z, and therefore we can sell it and make a ton of profit? So there's a lot of studies that are never done. So science only knows what science knows. And that's kind of the limitations, I think, of longevity. Is now we have these 40 studies that were done, and somebody wrote a paper to pull it all together, and this is what we can infer from all these rat studies of people taking turmeric, or rats taking turmeric. They live 20% longer, and that's statistically significant. So we're supposed to take that. Yeah. Well,
I've done that one.
Wait, you've studied rats, or you've taken turmeric?
No, I've done the turmeric. Yeah. Well, yeah, because I believed the stuff I read on social media, and and like all those things, I gave up after a few weeks because I couldn't be bothered.
It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money to take all these things, and plus they all have side effects, right? So if you take a lot of turmeric, then, I mean, for me at least, it's like kind of gives me a sour stomach if I take too much of it. So, and I do take a ton of pills, and I spend a bunch of money on it, and I get excited about these things. But I also realize,
I'm just going to put a disclaimer here, right? You should not be coming to the Identity of the Center podcast for medical advice. Please carry on.
Please carry on. So the long and short of it, though, is exactly to that point. I'm not a doctor. So then you start reading these articles about how these things work, and I'm just like, I'm too confused. So I need somebody to explain to me. So if I could become an instant expert on something, I think it would be longevity. Now, at the same time, if we're not looking at the instant expert of because I could say, I would like to be an instant expert in Bitcoin, but that's still not going to tell me where Bitcoin is going to be 2 years from now. So if I was to, and I'm trying to advise my son, who is a junior in high school, getting ready to go into college, and I'm saying, well, what should he major in? What should he? And I'm not the type to tell him what to do, but I'm going to give him my life experience, and then let him take that as one of the inputs. I think computer coding, computer science, which is a focus on development, right? They have now information technology and computer science are different tracks, and information security fits in information technology. a lot of the information technology courses are like networking and these things that I'm thinking, well, maybe it's because I specialize in those things. I'm like, that stuff's easy. You don't need to go to college to learn that stuff. The computer science, if you can take 4 years and really focus on how to code and how to architect applications, you won't go hungry in this world, right? That is a great basis to build whatever career you build. So to me, that's what if I was 18 again, that's what I would get into is a computer science program.
Yeah.
What about you, Jeff?
Well, I just want to point out you absolutely crushed the longevity thing with that answer, so I can see where that would have been your been your first choice. I'm going to keep it simple because I wish I could play a musical instrument, guitar, piano, something like that. Be an expert musician at something. It's something that I've toyed around with in the past, and obviously, not obviously, but when I was younger, tried to get into it. But I've just never been musically inclined. Can't get my fingers to do the frets and the chord shapes and things like that on the guitar. Just haven't really sat down on the piano or anything like that. So I'm going to keep mine positive and simple and say, hey, I wish I could be an expert on an instrument. Let's just say guitar, because I think I've always been keen to try to learn that. So yeah. We've gone very long, much longer than we normally do, but it was a great conversation. Longevity as part of it as well. Before we wrap up, I want to give Paul a 30-second window here to any final thoughts as far as the conversation. And then in addition to that, if there's anything else that's coming up, I know that the European Identity Conference is coming up, I think in May, or maybe some other blogs or webinars that might be coming through. The floor is yours, Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Well, it's been a pleasure, I should say, and I hope I haven't confused people even more than they were before they started to listen. There is, you say, EIC, European Identity Conference, which is now coming up for its 20th year, I think. It's happening from May the 9th to the 13th in Berlin. So if the registration is open now, it's also, if you go to our website, KuppingerCole.com, go to EIC, there is some blogs there. There's one that's just been published by Martin Kuppinger, all about the identity fabric, which goes into a lot more detail than I did, which is well worth a read. There's modesty doesn't prevent me from saying that there's a blog by me as well on there, should you want to read that. But there are several interesting bits there. That's the main thing. And as I said, it's the European Identity Conference has become probably the biggest conference devoted just to identity, certainly in Europe. So yeah, I hope anyone that's in Europe at that time we'd love to see you. Thankfully, it now looks like it's going to be, fully live, as in real people are going to be there. So, but there is still the virtual option for anyone that wants that as well. So that's the main thing. I think I've done my job there of promoting that. So, and as I said, look out for the Leadership Compass on Dream around about the same time.
Very cool. And I'll have a link to KuppingerCole as well as a link to that Identity Fabrics article or blog that Martin wrote in the show notes so people can check it out. But yeah, check it out at KuppingerCole.com. I'll also have a link to Paul's LinkedIn. Hopefully, Paul, you're open to getting connections from folks out there and interacting that way as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. LinkedIn is a challenge these days, I'm sure you know, but if you can avoid some of that, I still love to talk to people on LinkedIn from this community. So yeah,
Jim and I too. Jim, any final thoughts before we wrap up this week?
KuppingerCole does a fantastic job. So I second getting out there, signing up, getting on their newsletters. You get links to a lot of free webinars and the ability to get great information. They also have a fantastic podcast, so don't mind pumping that a little bit. Matthias does a really good job with that podcast. And, I guess I just wish you guys had an American identity conference. And in the meantime, Jeff, I think we should put in to go to the European one. I'd be willing to put a mask on and get on an airplane for 8 hours for that. What do you say?
I'm totally down. My only journey into Germany was Frankfurt Airport, and that's it. So I've never actually had, on the ground experience. I would totally be up for that. But we'll have to see how things go. I think as the world continues to open up here. So I'm all in favor of it, though. I'm glad to see more things becoming live. As long as people are safe and healthy, I'm all favor for it. All right, let's go ahead and wrap it up there. I know this is kind of one of our longer ones, but I really enjoyed the conversation. Paul, thank you so much for being a part of that conversation with us. From our perspective, right? Feel free to check us out on the web. We're at idacpodcast.com. We're on Twitter at idacpodcast. And Jim and I recently started doing a live stream every week, roughly, on YouTube, which you can find us at idac.live. That'll take you right to our YouTube channel. And, it's I won't say it's less prepared. It's, more freewheeling opinion, kind of whatever is spur of the moment for whenever we decide to figure out what we're going to talk about at that time. So, that's the kind of conversation we try to get into. So hopefully people will kind of check that out and subscribe, to the podcast, to the YouTube channel, those sorts of things. So with that, we'll go ahead and leave it for this week. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Jim. And thank you for listening. And we'll talk with everyone in the next one. Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.